All right, Doston, welcome back to Crypto Brain. Today's topic has rapidly evolved into one of the most controversial and emotionally charged narratives in the entire crypto space, because across social media, a rumor has been spreading at an alarming speed, almost like wildfire, suggesting that perhaps a trillion-dollar institution like BlackRock has quietly started showing interest around a meme token known as TOSHI. And naturally, this single idea alone has been enough to send crypto Twitter into absolute chaos. But before we get carried away by speculation, it is essential, absolutely essential, to set the record straight. There has been no official confirmation whatsoever that BlackRock has invested $100 million into TOSHI, nor has Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, made any statement indicating endorsement of any meme-based digital asset. If something of that magnitude had actually occurred, the market reaction would not be subtle. It would be violent, immediate, and unmistakably visible across liquidity flows, order books, and institutional tracking data. However, in crypto markets, reality often takes a back seat to something far more powerful: perception and narrative. And that is precisely where things start to become intellectually interesting. Because when we step away from social media noise and examine BlackRock's actual strategic direction, a very different picture begins to emerge. We are witnessing a global transition where traditional finance is gradually integrating blockchain infrastructure into its core framework, not as an experiment, but as a long-term structural evolution. Tokenization of real-world assets is no longer a theoretical concept. It is actively being developed, tested, and deployed across institutional products. Ethereum-based systems are increasingly being used as settlement layers for financial instruments that until recently existed entirely within traditional banking rails. We are talking about treasury instruments, money market funds, and multi-trillion-dollar asset classes slowly being digitized and brought on-chain. Now pause for a moment and consider the scale of that transformation. When the largest asset manager in the world begins reshaping its architecture around blockchain infrastructure, the entire market inevitably starts reinterpreting every emerging trend through that same lens. And this is exactly how narratives begin to form in crypto. Suddenly, even assets that have no direct institutional connection begin to be viewed as part of a broader liquidity rotation story. This is where tokens like TOSHI enter the conversation. Not because of fundamentals in the traditional sense, but because of how crypto cycles behave when liquidity expands and risk appetite returns. Historically, every major bull cycle in crypto has followed a similar psychological structure. First, capital flows into Bitcoin as the perceived safe digital macro asset. Then Ethereum begins to gain traction as the infrastructure layer. And finally, when liquidity becomes abundant and speculative confidence peaks, capital begins to rotate aggressively into high-risk, high-virality assets, meme coins. And this is not theory. This is observable market behavior, repeated across multiple cycles. Dogecoin, Shiba Inu, and countless other meme-driven assets have all followed this exact trajectory. Initially dismissed as jokes, later becoming some of the most aggressive performers in the entire market. Now, TOSHI, in this context, is being framed by parts of the community as a potential narrative-driven asset rather than a fundamentally anchored project. Its strength lies not in traditional valuation metrics, but in community energy, social amplification, and speculative momentum. In other words, it thrives on attention dynamics rather than cash flow models. And that is where the psychology becomes critical, because in crypto, attention is liquidity in disguise. The more eyes on a narrative, the more capital tends to flow into it, regardless of underlying fundamentals. But here is where things become even more interesting. The institutional world and the retail world operate on completely different emotional frameworks. Institutions build infrastructure, retail builds narratives, and when those two forces unintentionally align, even temporarily, the market can experience explosive volatility. But does that mean institutions are secretly involved in meme tokens like TOSHI? There is currently no evidence to support that claim. However, what cannot be ignored is the broader environment being created by institutional adoption of blockchain technology. When liquidity enters the system at a structural level, it does not flow evenly, it moves in waves, and those waves often begin at the top of the risk curve before eventually stabilizing into more established assets. This is why speculative sectors in crypto often outperform during early expansion phases of bull cycle, because capital is searching for asymmetric returns, and asymmetric returns are rarely found in low volatility assets. So the real question is not whether BlackRock has purchased TOSHI. The real question is whether the next phase of global liquidity expansion will once again create the conditions where meme-driven assets experience exponential growth, and history suggests that this possibility cannot be dismissed lightly. Every cycle in crypto has taught the same lesson in different forms. What appears irrational in the beginning becomes dominant in hindsight. What is laughed at today often becomes the headline story tomorrow, and what is ignored during accumulation phases often becomes the most aggressively chased narrative during distribution phases. So when people ask whether TOSHI is connected to institutional flows, the more accurate response is not a yes or no. It is an observation about timing, liquidity, and human behavior. Because in the end, crypto is not just a technological revolution. It is a psychological market operating at extreme speed, and in such an environment, narratives can sometimes move faster than facts. So as we stand here today, watching speculation circulate and theories multiply across social platforms, the only rational position is to separate verified data from emotional interpretation. BlackRock has not officially entered the meme coin space. Larry Fink has not endorsed TOSHI or any similar asset. But the broader system they are actively shaping, tokenization, digital asset infrastructure, and on-chain finance, is undeniably transforming the landscape in which assets like TOSHI exist. And that in itself is what keeps this entire conversation alive. Because in crypto, sometimes the most powerful move is not what has already happened, it is what people believe might happen next.